Jake stood in his front yard, staring at the letter in his hands, his grip tightening with every word his eyes scanned. The official HOA notice bore the typical bureaucratic language, cold and detached, but the message was clear: trim your hedges immediately or face escalating fines. His jaw clenched. His hedges? The same ones he had carefully shaped and maintained for years, standing tall and vibrant along the edge of his property? They were perfectly neat, a living green wall that provided both privacy and a touch of elegance. But that wasn't good enough for them. A gust of wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the distant sounds of suburban life, the hum of lawnmowers, a child's laughter echoing down the cul-de-sac, the faint barking of a dog. Yet beneath it all, Jake could hear something else. The unseen, ever-present force that dictated how he and his neighbors lived their lives. The Homeowners Association. And at the center of it, like a self-appointed queen perched on a throne of ridiculous regulations, was Karen. As if summoned by his growing irritation, she appeared. Karen approached from the sidewalk with the unmistakable stride of someone who thrived on control. Clipboard in hand, oversized sunglasses shielding her eyes, she moved like an inspector general on a battlefield. Her blonde bob, precise and stiff, barely shifted as she came to a stop a few feet from Jake's property line. "Jake," she greeted, her voice syrupy with false politeness. "I see you got our notice." He folded the letter slowly, shoving it into his back pocket. "Yeah, got it. And I gotta say, it's a bit ridiculous." Karen gasped softly, placing a hand on her chest like he had just insulted her personally. "Oh, Jake, you know it's nothing personal. The rules exist to keep our neighborhood looking presentable." She gestured vaguely at the houses around them, as if she were the guardian of some pristine utopia. Jake exhaled, forcing himself to remain calm. "Karen, my hedges are trimmed. They're healthy. They look good. What exactly is the issue here?" Karen's lips curled into something between a smirk and a grimace. "They could be tidier. They're not uniform and some of the tops extend past the regulation height." She tapped her clipboard. "Page 32 of the HOA guidelines." Jake let out a dry chuckle. "Right. Because an inch too high is clearly destroying the fabric of this community." Karen's smile didn't waver, but a flicker of annoyance passed over her face. "Rules are rules, Jake. If we make one exception, suddenly everyone starts bending them." She tilted her head. "I'm sure you understand." Oh, he understood. He understood that Karen didn't care about the hedges. This was about power. Control. He also understood that giving in wouldn't end it. Because Karen had a history. Last year, she had bullied an elderly neighbor into repainting his entire house because the color wasn't HOA approved. The poor guy had barely been able to afford it. Then there was the young couple who had been forced to tear down their children's playset after Karen deemed it an eyesore. Every time she couched it in polite phrases, just following the rules, ensuring neighborhood standards, maintaining property values. But everyone knew the truth. Karen liked to win. She liked the power she held over the people who lived here. And now she had set her sights on Jake. He crossed his arms. "And what happens if I don't trim them?" Karen let out a soft laugh, tilting her head. "Oh, Jake, I don't want this to escalate. But you know how it works. Fines. Daily penalties. And if you ignore those, well, we have the ability to place a lien on your home." She said it casually, as if threatening his property was no big deal. Jake's fingers curled into a fist at his side. "You do that? Over some hedges?" Karen sighed dramatically. "I don't want to. But everyone has to follow the same rules. I'm just doing my job." Bullshit. She was enjoying this. Jake took a slow breath. He had two choices: cave and let Karen win or push back. For a brief moment he considered just trimming the damn hedges. It wasn't worth the headache. He could get the shears, cut them down to whatever ridiculous standard Karen wanted, and move on. But then he saw the way she was looking at him. That smug satisfaction. She thought she had already won. A plan began forming in the back of his mind. "Oh, don't worry, Karen," he said, his voice smooth. "I'll make sure they're trimmed." Her expression flickered with momentary suspicion, but she quickly regained her composure. "Glad to hear it. I knew you'd be reasonable." With that, she turned, striding away like a monarch who had just settled a trivial dispute among peasants. Jake watched her go, his lips curling into a slow, wicked smile. Oh, he was going to trim his hedges, all right. Just not in the way she expected. That night, Jake sat at his kitchen table, the HOA letter spread out before him like a battle plan. A single overhead light flickered slightly, casting a warm glow over the wooden surface, but his focus was locked on the words in front of him. He traced a finger along the carefully worded demands, his mind working through the possibilities. The way Karen spoke, it was clear she expected him to roll over, to submit like so many others had. But she had underestimated him. He reached for his laptop, opening the digital copy of the HOA rulebook. If they wanted to play by the rules, then he would play by the rules, he'd just make sure it was on his terms. His eyes scanned through the tedious legal jargon, looking for anything he could use. Then he found it. Hedges must be trimmed and well kept. No mention of shape. No specifics on style. Nothing beyond vague, subjective wording. A slow grin spread across his face. They wanted his hedges trimmed? Fine. He would give them a trim they'd never forget. The next morning he made a call. Leo, I need a favor. Leo's laughter rang through the speaker before Jake even explained. You only call me when you're about to do something insane. Jake leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the neatly sculpted green wall lining his yard. Let's just say I have an HOA problem. And I need your artistic touch. Leo was an old college buddy, a landscaper with a specialty in topiary art. He had carved everything from spirals to elaborate animal sculptures in wealthy clients' gardens. But this was something different. I'm listening, Leo said, the intrigue evident in his voice. Jake laid it out for him, and by the time he finished, Leo was howling with laughter. You're an evil genius, he said between chuckles. I'll be there Saturday. The anticipation made the rest of the week crawl. Every time Jake saw Karen patrolling the neighborhood, clipboard in hand like a badge of authority, his resolve strengthened. She had pushed him, thinking he'd break. Instead, she had given him the perfect opportunity. By the time Saturday rolled around, Leo arrived with his truck full of tools and an energy that matched Jake's own. They stood in front of the hedges, sizing up the canvas of thick greenery. Leo whistled low. This is going to be glorious. Jake clapped him on the back. Let's get to work. The sun blazed overhead as they began, the rhythmic snipping of hedge clippers blending with the occasional buzz of an electric trimmer. Leaves and branches fell in soft cascades, covering the ground in a thick, green carpet. The work was slow and meticulous, but with every passing hour, the shape became clearer. By midday, a few neighbors had started to notice. Mr. Thompson from 2 houses down wandered over, shading his eyes as he took in the developing structure. Jake, what exactly are you doing? Jake wiped a bead of sweat from his brow and grinned. Just following HOA guidelines. Thompson squinted, stepping back for a better view. The realization dawned on him, and his eyes widened. A slow, incredulous chuckle escaped him. No way. Jake simply smiled and went back to trimming. Word spread quickly. By the time the sun began its descent, a small audience had gathered, whispering and laughing amongst themselves. Some took photos, others simply watched, waiting for the final reveal. As Jake stepped back, wiping the last flecks of greenery from his hands, he admired their work. It was perfect. Towering above the yard, sculpted with meticulous precision, was an unmistakable giant middle finger. It stood proud, defiant, facing directly toward Karen's house. The details were sharp, the curve of the knuckles, the defined ridges along the finger. It was a masterpiece of petty rebellion. Leo doubled over laughing. This is a work of art. Jake nodded, satisfaction thrumming through him. Karen wanted the hedges trimmed. Now they're trimmed. The murmurs of amusement from the neighbors turned into outright cackles as more people gathered. Phones were raised, pictures snapped. Within minutes, it was making its way onto social media. Jake stepped back onto his porch, stretching his arms. He could already picture the moment Karen would see it. That self-righteous smugness wiped clean off her face, replaced with sputtering outrage. The evening air carried the sounds of distant laughter as the last rays of sunlight caught the perfectly manicured defiance standing tall in his yard. Now all that was left to do was wait. Sunday morning arrived with the crisp scent of freshly cut grass hanging in the air. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of birds greeting the early sun. Jake sipped his coffee on the porch, eyes fixed on Karen's house across the street. Any moment now. Then, like clockwork, the front door swung open. Karen stepped out in her usual uniform, pressed slacks, a pastel cardigan, and her ever-present clipboard tucked under one arm. She took 2 steps down her porch before she froze, her entire body going rigid. Jake watched with barely concealed amusement as her head tilted upward, her sunglasses sliding down her nose as she took in the enormous, beautifully sculpted middle finger towering above his hedges. For a second she didn't move. Then her face contorted. Even from a distance, Jake could see her mouth opening and closing, a silent sputtering of disbelief. Her hands trembled as she clutched the clipboard tighter, knuckles turning white. The reaction was everything he had hoped for. Karen stormed down her walkway, heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she made a beeline for his yard. She stopped just short of his driveway, her face a deep shade of crimson. "Jake!" she shrieked, voice strangled with rage. He took a leisurely sip of his coffee before strolling down the steps, his expression the perfect mask of polite confusion. "Morning, Karen. Something wrong?" She jabbed a perfectly manicured finger toward the hedge, her breaths coming in short, furious bursts. What is this?" Jake turned as if seeing it for the first time. He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "All that? Just a little topiary work. Looks good, doesn't it?" Her lips curled in outrage. This is an attack. A direct violation of the HOA guidelines." Jake raised an eyebrow. "I don't see how. You told me to trim my hedges. They're trimmed. In fact, they've never looked neater." Karen's hands trembled as she flipped through the HOA rulebook, scanning frantically for a clause to wield against him. Jake knew she wouldn't find anything. He had read that rulebook cover to cover. Nowhere did it say what shape the hedges had to be, only that they needed to be well kept. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Jake took another sip of coffee. "Oh, I know it is." Around them, a few neighbors had gathered again, some trying and failing to suppress laughter. Karen's nostrils flared as she realized she was becoming a spectacle. She straightened, trying to compose herself. "Well," she said, forcing a brittle smile, "I hope you understand this isn't over. I'll be issuing a formal complaint." Jake spread his hands in mock surrender. "By all means. I'm sure the HOA board will be thrilled to see how carefully I followed the rules." Her eyes narrowed. She knew she couldn't win this round, not yet. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched back toward her house. Clipboard clutched so tightly it was a wonder it didn't snap in two. Jake watched her go, the corners of his lips twitching upward. This wasn't just about the hedges anymore. Now it was war. Jake barely had time to enjoy his victory before the storm arrived. By Monday morning, the HOA had sent an official summons to a hearing. Karen worked fast, too fast. She wanted him gone before the rest of the neighborhood could turn this into an even bigger spectacle. The notice accused him of violating the aesthetic harmony of the community. It was a vague, flimsy charge, one meant to be open to interpretation. She thought she had him cornered. But Jake wasn't walking into this unprepared. He arrived at the HOA meeting early, dressed neatly in a button-down and slacks, the picture of calm professionalism. Karen, on the other hand, sat at the center of the board's table like a queen presiding over a trial, her expression tight with suppressed fury. A few of her staunchest supporters sat beside her, wearing identical looks of disdain. The room filled quickly. More people than usual showed up, whispering amongst themselves, stealing glances at Jake. Word had spread, and judging by the amused glances and barely restrained grins, most of them were here for him. Karen cleared her throat, calling the meeting to order. She launched into a speech about respecting neighborhood standards, barely concealing her rage beneath a thin veil of professionalism. Then she turned her gaze toward Jake. "Do you have anything to say in your defense before we vote?" she asked, voice dripping with condescension. Jake leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Actually, yes. I took the liberty of reviewing our HOA guidelines again, since I know how much we all love following the rules." He pulled out a neatly printed copy and slid it across the table. "Nowhere does it specify what shape a hedge must be. Nowhere does it say creativity is forbidden. The only requirement? That they be well kept. Which, as you can all see, mine are." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's fingers twitched, but she maintained her composure. "Jake, you deliberately shaped them into an obscene gesture." Jake shrugged. "Obscenity is subjective. Some might call it a work of art." A chuckle broke out from the back of the room. Karen's face darkened. "This is not about personal expression," she snapped. "This is about maintaining dignity in our neighborhood." Jake leaned back, tilting his head. "Karen, I find it funny that dignity only seems to matter when you're personally offended." He let the words hang for a moment before continuing, his tone even. "See, this isn't really about the hedges. It's about control. It's about the way you enjoy pushing people around. But what happens when someone doesn't just roll over?" He gestured toward the crowd. "People are tired of the way you run things. And now, they're finally talking about it." Karen stiffened. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. She could feel the shift in the room. A man in the crowd cleared his throat. "Actually," he said, standing up, "Jake has a point." Heads turned. It was Mr. Thompson, the same neighbor who had laughed at the hedge days ago. He folded his arms, looking directly at Karen. I've lived here for 10 years, and in that time I've seen this HOA enforce ridiculous rules just because someone felt like it. My wife and I were forced to change our fence, at our expense, because Karen decided it wasn't visually cohesive. A woman in the back raised her hand. She made my son take down his basketball hoop, said it disturbed the peace, but nobody had ever complained. One by one more voices joined in. Stories of nitpicking, of arbitrary fines, of Karen wielding the HOA like a weapon to force compliance. The tide was turning. Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. This meeting is about Jake, she snapped, but her voice had lost its earlier edge. Jake smiled. Is it? Silence stretched for several long heavy seconds. Then one of the board members, an older gentleman who had mostly stayed quiet, sighed and set his pen down. Karen, he said tiredly, I think we need to reassess some things. Starting with leadership. Karen's face turned deathly pale. You can't be serious. Another board member nodded. This isn't the first complaint we've had. Maybe it's time for a change. And just like that, her power crumbled. The vote was swift and brutal. By the end of the night, Karen was removed as HOA president. She sputtered, she protested, but in the face of overwhelming support for her resignation, there was nothing she could do. She stormed out of the meeting, her reign officially over. Jake watched her go, the satisfaction deep in his chest unlike anything he'd felt in years. The next morning he stepped onto his porch with a fresh cup of coffee, admiring his handiwork one last time. Then with a slow, deliberate nod, he picked up the hedge clippers. Time to trim.